Hi, my name is Vanessa Conlin, Master of Wine and Head of Wine at Wine Access. Today I'm tasting the Brugnon Sélection Brut Champagne Non-Vintage as part of the Discover France Wine Folly set that I curated with my friend Madeleine Paquette of Wine Folly. So, why should we care about Champagne? Well, it's one of the most famous regions in the world for growing high-quality wine. It's also one of the most labor-intensive winemaking processes that you can possibly endeavor to create. This style is emulated around the world by many different growing regions and producers, but you can only call it Champagne if it's actually from the region of Champagne. So if you were to hop a flight into Paris, get in your car, depending on whether you have a lead foot, you will arrive in Champagne in about an hour and a half, 2 hours by car. It's a very cool growing region, and the grapes really struggle to ripen here. But before we go any further, why don't we take a look at this wine, assess its aromas and its flavors, and then talk about the region in more depth. So right off the bat, it's sort of a lemon gold color. There's this beautiful fine mousse of bubbles, very delicate. On the nose, sort of a fresh cut apple peel note to it, pear. There's a white floral component and lots of citrus, yellow citrus in this to me. And sort of hiding in the background of this is this barely perceptible sort of marzipan toastiness to it. Almost like a fresh brioche that just came out of the oven. It's really intriguing. And we'll talk about why that happens in the glass when we get to the winemaking of Champagne. So let's taste this. And if you want to pause here so you can taste on your own without being influenced by my descriptors, feel free to come back in a few minutes. But if you're tasting with me, as you'll see, I want this wine to touch every corner of my palate. So I'm really going to swish it around everywhere. I'm not going to be afraid to make funny faces and noises because I promise it will only enhance your enjoyment of this wine in the long run. So let's taste. So when I taste wine, I like to start with the thing that's most obvious about what's in the glass in front of me. And for me, it's the acidity. This has a real backbone of acid, sort of a bracing acidity. And I mean that really in the most positive of way. It's making me want to go back for another sip. It's making me think of all the wonderful foods I want to pair this with. And it's just truly, truly sort of ethereal in its light-bodiedness. It's almost sort of has this feel of a lift on my palate. And this is really what is prized in Champagne. This bracing acidity, this lightness on its feet, and this really intriguing array of fruit and non-fruit. So I'm getting again on the palate that apple, the citrus, the pear, and again, this sort of toasty marzipan note, and a little bit of a textural component that's almost like a breadth of palate. And that comes from part of the winemaking. So let's start in the vineyard. The main three varieties that you need to know about Champagne are Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Meunier. Now, you might hear that also referred to as Pinot Meunier, but we've dropped the Pinot in the last several years. So now it's Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Meunier. Now, in actuality, there are other varieties that are permitted by law in the region, like Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc, but in practice, you rarely see them. Now, this is about 65% Chardonnay and 35% Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is a red grape, but this wine is pale. So something that's very important in Champagne is pressing. Now, if you think about a red grape, if you bite it in half, even though the skin is red, the flesh is pale. So if you're to very gently press red grapes, you can still make a pale wine out of the red grapes. So when the grapes are harvested here, very gently pressed, a base wine is made. Now this base wine is going to be basically undrinkable at this point. Pretty neutral and very, very high in acidity. But what is important about the Champagne method or the traditional method or the method champenoise is what happens after that. So after that initial fermentation, more yeast and sugar is added to the base wine, and a second fermentation happens in the bottle. What happens during fermentation? Well, yeasts consume the sugars in grapes, and the byproduct is alcohol and CO2. Well, what happens if that happens inside a closed bottle? Well, you're left with that CO2 trapped in the bottle, producing a sparkling wine. The other sort of magical thing that happens while this wine has a second fermentation in bottle and then rests in the bottle for many, many months, sometimes up to many years, is what's called autolysis. Now, don't be afraid of what I'm about to say, which is that the dead yeast cells stay in the bottle after the fermentation. They've essentially sacrificed themselves for our pleasure because the yeasts die during fermentation. Now, the wine left in contact with these dead lees provides that sort of toastiness, that brioche, that beautiful breadth of texture and roundness that you get from beautiful champagne. At the time of bottling, the yeast is removed. This is called disgorgement. And this is the opportunity for the producer to really decide the final style of the wine. Something called dosage can be added or not, and this will determine the sweetness level. Now, most champagnes are dry. Back in the day, this type of wine was, very popular with the czars of Russia. And in that time, the wine was actually very, very sweet. Just side fact, Peter the Great was known to drink 4 bottles of champagne every single day. So talk about a hangover. But most styles of champagne that you see in the market now are dry. Or brut, meaning there's only 12 grams per liter of dosage in that bottle. And even though there might be up to 12 grams, it can often taste completely dry. And that's because the sugar is not to really add sweetness. It's just to balance the bracing acidity that comes from the wines of Champagne. You can also find wines called Brut Nature or zero dosage, in which only wine is added again at bottling, no sugar. So it's a range of different styles that you can find on the market. Some other terms you might want to know are vintage and either non-vintage or multi-vintage. It's the same thing. Vintage, of course, being wine that's all harvested from the same year and is a little snapshot of that year in isolation, versus multi-vintage or non-vintage, which is a blend of different vintages. And the goal with this style is really to have continuity so that if you were to buy the same champagne, multi-vintage, one year, the next year, the year after, you won't notice a change. And this is where blending is extremely important in champagne. When those base wines are produced, producers will hold back, in some cases, decades of base wine. And that's so they can blend it and ultimately have a very consistent wine on the market for year after year. Some other terms you might want to know are Blanc De Blanc or Blanc de Noir. Blanc De Blanc meaning white from white, so it's all Chardonnay. Or Blanc de Noir, meaning white from red. So these are red grapes that are pressed into a white wine. A few other terms you might want to know are grower champagne. This is sort of very catchword right now, or something that's very popular. And that means the grower is also making his or her own wine. But it's possible in Champagne not to grow any fruit yourself at all, and only to produce wine that you've purchased from other growers. And in that case, it would be called NM, or négociant manipulant, if you want to get really fancy. So this is a beautiful wine. If you've enjoyed this tasting, which is just the first of 12 in this Discover France set with Wine Folly, I encourage you to keep watching, as next we're going to go to the Loire Valley for another traditional method sparkling wine, Crémant de Loire.